In quantitative research, we also need to consider the sample, the group of people that we're studying. Because obviously, we're not typically interested in that particular group. We're interested in a larger population, but we choose this group to study. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the main concepts in sampling in quantitative research studies. Paying attention to the sample or the people that are studied is really key to figuring out if an article is relevant for you and the people that you work with. So I think looking at subjects, the subjects that were studied, is always a big part of me evaluating if I want to read an article and if I think it's going to be useful for me. So related to sampling, let's talk about some important terminology. First off, the term subjects is not the population as a whole. So while you may be interested in Ironman, triathlon participants, you're probably not studying or conducting a study or reading a study where they examined all of the Ironman participants. They probably looked at a subgroup of them. And those are called the subjects. The subjects are the actual participants in a study. Subjects typically are a subgroup of a bigger population. So maybe, you're reading an article that's about active elderly people. The population would be the active elderly people. The subjects are the people that they found that participated in the study and did whatever it is that they did in the study. So the population is the group of people that you want to know about and that you want to be able to apply this to. So again, those are two important concepts, subjects and population. Typically, a researcher, when they want to do a study, they start by identifying a population of interest. And they also think about what is it what aspect of performance in our field, typically it's what aspect of performance are they interested in. So they look at those two things. What am I interested in terms of performance measures? And then what population specifically I'm interested in applying it to. While some measures of performance may work in a wide range of individuals, regardless of age or gender or sports participation. Often, though, we see very different reactions to different types of treatments depending upon population characteristics like age and gender and so on. So typically, though, the researcher starts by identifying a population of interest, and then he or she figures out how to go about finding a representative sample of that population. So selecting a sample is really important because we need that sample to be representative of that population. So again, if my goal is to examine some aspect of soccer athletes and their performance or some type of treatment to improve their soccer performance, and I do the study on a group of people that participates in badminton, while we may think that we could see similar effects on soccer players, we don't know. So that's not the best sample because it's not representative of the population as a whole. So methods for selecting the sample is going to be really important and can have very significant implications on the ability to apply research findings to the population. We see this in the research a lot. A lot of studies have been done not on humans, but on rats. And that's because you can do things to rats that you can't do to humans. Those studies are really useful. We've learned really important things from those, but it's difficult to really say that what we saw in the rats is very similar to what we'd see in humans. Let me give you an example. Way back in the early 1900s, people were interested in the effect of exercise on risk of disease and longevity. So to study this, they used rats. And I apologize if anybody's offended by the cruelty aspect of this, but this all occurred before we had ethical guidelines for treatment of animals. The rats were used to look at, hey, if we have a rat exercise every day, does it live longer than rats that don't exercise? So they took a whole bunch of rats, some of them just had them sit in their cage all day, fed them food. They had another group of rats where they fed them food, similar amount of food, but they had them exercise every day. Well, it's hard to get rats to exercise. So their method of exercising was to take the rats and put them in water. If they're in water, they obviously want to live, so they swim, and they swim and swim and swim and swim and swim. To simulate, again, intense exercise, the kind of exercise that athletes do, they attached a weight to the tail of the rat so that they had to really swim pretty hard to stay above the water and keep breathing, right? What did they find out? They found out that the rats that exercised died at a much quicker rate than the rats who didn't exercise. So the conclusions of that study were that exercise is bad, right? Do you agree? Is that what they studied? No, right? First off, we found that the sample was not obviously representative of the population, but most importantly, the methods that were applied to get the rats to exercise were not the kinds of methods or reasons that you would use for exercising. What they did every day when they made the rats exercise wasn't just make them exercise, but they scared them to death, right? They were terrified every day that they were going to drown. And what it ended up being really was a study of how stress can affect longevity. But again, you have to choose a sample that is representative of the population, as close as possible. So if your population has about 50% men, 50% women, you want your sample to be similar in its breakdown and so on. If your sample is or your population that you're interested in is college-age athletes, then you want to choose athletes that are of college age, and so on. So again, methods of selecting a sample is going to be really important because otherwise we can have unintended consequences and findings that aren't relative to the actual goals of your study or the study that you're reading. So when you're reading different studies, please make sure that you're thinking about, hey, is this sample really representative of that population? Have we tried to control for as many factors as possible? Typically, it's not possible to examine the entire population, therefore a sample must be used. However, we do see some studies where the population is so limited that they can study nearly or all of the population, but that's fairly uncommon. Some terms and concepts that are important for sampling, and I've kind of gotten around these and talked about these a little bit already, but let's put a name to them. The sample size is how big or how many people you're going to measure. Sample size is going to be really important in, again, how applicable this study is to the population as a whole. If the population is thousands of people and your sample is only 2 people, there's a chance that those 2 people you got are really different than the average person in the population. So that's an issue. That can lead to things like sampling error. Sampling error is something that's inherent in sampling. No matter how much you control for your population selection, your sample selection, you're going to have maybe, some people that are outliers that are a little bit different from the mean and so on. So sampling error, though, can give us results that are atypical of the population as a whole. Researchers' goal is to typically minimize sampling error as much as possible. So trying to get a sample that is similar to the population as a whole is really key, and that reduces the chances of sampling error. Sampling bias is a little different. It still throws off our data, but sampling bias is the result of exclusion of possible subjects and because of errors in sample selection. Sampling bias is not inherent and can be avoided with careful selection. However, sometimes it's difficult to avoid that. For instance, if your goal is to study, athletes and their resistance to heat illness, and you work at a university in Alaska, your sampling bias might be that you're using individuals that are not acclimatized to heat, and therefore because of convenience. Now, you can still conduct the study, but as a good researcher would do, you would identify potential sampling bias in your study, saying that we were unable to get people that were exactly like the population that we're interested in. We did the best as we could, but there is a chance of some errors in the conclusions because of this sampling bias. Sampling bias is typically theoretically avoidable, but maybe practically unavoidable. Versus sampling error is something that is always going to be present to some extent because you can't guarantee that you're getting kind of a nice even distribution of people from the population. Sample size is an important consideration when we are looking at the articles in our field. The sample size is the number of subjects in the sample for a population. So, you'll see often this reported as an N value. So they'll say, we examined 38 female distance runners, and their response to this new training program. The N would be 38. The sample size is 38. Larger sample sizes give us more statistical power when we're doing inferential statistics and allow us to some more statistical power in terms of determining if differences between groups are real or not. So in general, larger sample sizes are better. However, you don't need to have massive sample sizes to still have fairly significant statistical power. The number of subjects in a sample is somewhat dependent upon the population as a whole that you're attempting to describe. If our population is fairly small, like if we are attempting to do a study of, Kenyan Olympic runners, where maybe there's been 100 in the last 10 years, if we want to talk about them and how they respond to a specific treatment, because the population's fairly small, we actually need a sample size that's a fairly large percentage of the population as a whole if we want to have good statistical power. So there are charts that show this. If you have a population of 100 people and you want to make some conclusion about them where you're 95% confident that the differences are real, you actually need a very significant percentage of the population in your sample. So you need 79 out of the 100 people to participate. When we start to look at much larger populations, which is typical, right? Most of the studies we look at, they're attempting to apply this treatment to all physically active people or college-age athletes. Those are populations where there's hundreds of thousands of people or even hundreds or even millions of people. To have enough statistical power to make inferences about these populations, you need larger sample sizes than we did when there were 100 people, but we don't need huge percentages of their population. So we only need 300 or so, to make conclusions about those populations. So as the size of the population itself increases, the proportion of the population that you need to sample decreases. But again, important to understand that large sample sizes are going to give us a little more confidence in the findings than smaller sample sizes. Again, when you look at a case study of one person, we all know that one person who can exercise at a level that you could never do without getting injured, and so on. So one person does not give you a lot of statistical power. 10 gives you more. 20 even more than that. So again, sample size is an important characteristic when looking at these studies and considering, did they utilize an appropriate sample size? Again, most peer-reviewed journals are going to ensure that people are using an adequate number of samples or subjects in their studies to make inferences about a population. There's a number of ways also that individuals can select the people for their sample. There are a lot of selection strategies that are going to help, again, reduce the chances of bias or error in your sampling. Typically, the way we select people, if possible, is through random samples, meaning, if we have a population of people that we want to learn more about, we randomly pull people from that population in an attempt to getting a wide range of people from that sample or from that population. So random sampling is a procedure for selecting members of a sample. So if you have 100 people, you may assign everybody a number from 1 to 100 and then draw numbers written on a piece of paper from 1 to 100 from a hat. If your number gets called, then you're a person in the sample. You're a subject. So all members in that circumstance have an equal chance of being in a sample. Now, let's say you have a group of 100 people, 50 males, 50 females, and you randomly pull the people's names out of the hat or numbers out of the hat. There is a chance that you could get, if you're trying to do a sample of 20, there is a chance that you could get 19 males and 1 female or vice versa. That's a problem, especially if men and women react to this treatment differently. So random sampling does run the risk of giving you kind of an uneven balance in certain subject characteristics. If that's the case, then you may want to use different type of selection strategies, which we're going to talk about on a future slide. Non-random selection does not ensure equal chances of selection. Random is typically preferred over non-random, but there still are chances of sampling error in random selection strategies. So often what we'll see when we read the subject section of the methods for a study is a description of what type of sampling strategy they used. Again, the first two main types are either random sampling or non-random sampling. In random sampling, there are some subcategories that are important to note. A simple random sample means that the people were just completely randomly picked from the population as a whole. Stratified random samples means that we attempted to keep people in specific percentages within our subsample, right? So in the example I gave on the previous slide, if I have 100 people, 50 males, 50 females, and I think it's important that we maintain that percentage in our sample, then I'll basically take all of the women, give them a number from 1 to 50, and pick 10 from that group, and then take all the men and pick 10 from that group. That way I'm guaranteed to have both 10 men and 10 women. That's a stratified random sample. We can also use cluster random samples. Again, if I wanted to study maybe people from around the country, different geographical regions, but it's not feasible for me to go to all of the geographical regions, I may randomly choose 2 geographical regions and then randomly pick people from those 2 regions. That way I can only have to go to 2 different regions to gather that data. That's called a cluster-based random sample. A systematic random sample is still random in that, everybody has the same chance of being picked, but what we do there is choose every 10th person in a list of the population. Similar to a simple random sample, but instead it's systematic, meaning we're choosing people, every 10th person through this list. Non-random sampling types have a greater chance of sampling bias and are typically what's used in the research. If I want to study cross-country runners, collegiate cross-country runners, and I want to measure some aspect of their performance, it's really nearly impossible for me to randomly pick people from all of the cross-country runners in the country and then go there and study them. So often we see samples of convenience where we choose the people that are available to us. So maybe we choose athletes at the colleges around where I live or where I work. Or we choose volunteers because, again, it's going to be difficult to get people to participate. We can't make them participate, so we have to hope they participate. So often you'll see non-random sampling where it's a sample of convenience or a sample that's volunteers. Often it's intact groups. So you use a sports team at the university you work at, or a neighboring university, or a local high school, or whatever it may be. Those are non-random sampling types, and again, are running the risk of increased sampling bias. Snowball samples are where you choose a handful of subjects and then you ask them, hey, do you have anybody else that would want to participate? You see this a lot in, again, like studies on running groups where you get a couple people, you ask them, hey, is there anybody else in your group that you think might want to participate? Those are called snowball samples. But again, you'll see both random and non-random sampling types. Each has advantages and disadvantages. And you want to see that the researcher has taken every step possible to reduce the chances of sampling bias to ensure that the sample is representative of the population as a whole.